Alright, let's take a look at number 4. Decide if the following are true or false. So each one of these is going to be a true or false question. So rectangles have perpendicular diagonals. So here we have an example of a rectangle, and we have the diagonals drawn. So the diagonals intersect, and if you look at this angle right here, you can tell this is an obtuse angle, and this is an acute angle. So obviously the diagonals are not perpendicular. And no matter how I drag it so that it stays a rectangle, it's not going to turn into a right angle here. So that would be false. So we know that this first one here is false. So squares have perpendicular diagonals. So if we look at the rectangle here and look at the sides, if we get the sides to be the same, now you can kind of see that makes a right angle. So when I make the sides of the rectangle the same, it turns into a square. So here's another example of a square. So no matter how I change the side lengths of the square, this perpendicular here never changes. So no matter how I change the side lengths, the diagonals are always going to intersect to make a right angle. So that means that B is true. Parallelograms have perpendicular diagonals. So when we look at a statement like that, we're saying that, or the question is asking, do all parallelograms have perpendicular diagonals? So if you can just find one example where the diagonals are not perpendicular, then we have to say that that's false. And so if we just look at a parallelogram and we look at the diagonals, you can see here that it's an obtuse, so obviously it's not. And it's not going to, the only time the diagonals are going to become perpendicular is when we have either a square or and we'll wait to find out that answer. So we go back to this and we say parallelograms have perpendicular diagonals, and we say that is false. Now the next shape are a rhombus. So let's take a look at a rhombus. Okay, so here we have a rhombus, and all the sides are the same. And so if you look at the diagonals, it looks like they are perpendicular. And this one actually shows that they are. So no matter how I change the size or the shape of the rhombus, the sides on the outside are always the same, and the diagonals are always 90. Now since a rhombus is a parallelogram, notice that they show that the diagonals are bisected. But the question was, do rhombuses have perpendicular diagonals? And the answer to that is yes. So that is a true statement. Rectangles have congruent diagonals. So are the diagonals congruent? So as we look at this rectangle, and we want to see, are the diagonals equal? The diagonals are equal, and so the length of this entire diagonal is 28.9. The length of this entire diagonal is 28.9. And no matter how I change the shape of the rectangle, the diagonals are always going to be congruent. So rectangles have congruent diagonals. That is true. Parallelograms have congruent diagonals. So as we look at this parallelogram, it looks like it's a rectangle. Remember, a rectangle is a parallelogram. Let's start making this look more like a generic parallelogram. And so when it's a rectangle, AD and BC are equal. So now as I take A and I move it this way, you can kind of see that A is getting closer to D. So A gets closer to D, but look what happens to B when I move it this way. B is getting farther away from C. So this is the short diagonal, this is the long diagonal. If I have a short diagonal and a long diagonal, obviously they're not equal. So in a parallelogram, the diagonals are not congruent. So we can go back to our list and put false there. Squares have congruent diagonals. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so here we have our square, and as you look at the square, no matter how I change the size of it, B doesn't get any closer to D, and C doesn't get any closer to A. So it makes sense that the diagonals of a square are congruent. And so here we're showing the measure. The 16.83 is the length of the entire diagonal. So no matter how I change it, you can see that both diagonals stay the same. So squares have congruent diagonals. That is true. And the last thing we're going to look at is rhombuses have congruent diagonals. So like when we talked about the rectangle, so here we have a rhombus. Now, as I change the angle, this is still a rhombus because the sides are congruent. And you can see how A gets closer to D and B gets further away from C. So I have a short diagonal and I have a long diagonal. So the diagonals of a rhombus are not congruent. So rhombuses have congruent diagonals. That would be false.